My name is Adrian Mitchell. I'm 47 years old, and today I'm going to tell you how the man who built an empire ended up sleeping on the floor of an empty office because he trusted the wrong person. She didn't just take my money, she took my dignity, 15 years of effort, and handed it on a silver platter to a guy who barely knew how to tie his own tie. While I was working 16 hours a day, she was draining our accounts to finance her lover's lifestyle. And the worst part wasn't the theft, it was the gaslighting. Every time I noticed an inconsistency, every time I asked why capital was missing from our investment fund, she would look me straight in the eyes with a terrifying calm and tell me I was crazy. She called me paranoid, suggested I seek psychological help, and even convinced my own family that stress was making me lose my mind. She made me doubt my own shadow, while the two of them laughed at me in hotels paid for with my credit cards. But they made one fatal mistake. They thought they had completely broken me. What they didn't understand is that a man who has lost everything no longer fears consequences, and the silence of an intelligent man is far more dangerous than the screams of a desperate one. I stayed quiet, lowered my head, and waited for the exact moment to speak. And when I finally did, I destroyed her world with the same cold precision she used to destroy mine. If you like stories where betrayal has consequences and justice arrives without warning, leave a like and subscribe. Here we share real stories of revenge and lessons that are never forgotten. To understand how I reached the point of seeing my bank account drained to zero, while my wife was suggesting I check into a psychiatric clinic, I need to explain who I was before the storm. I wasn't born into money. Everything I had, every property, every investment, every ounce of status, I built with my own hands. I worked in large-scale logistics and distribution. It was a business of precision, cold numbers, and almost military discipline. My life ran like a Swiss watch. I woke up at 5 every morning, reviewed routes, inventory reports, and financial projections. I've always been a low-profile man, reserved, someone who prefers to observe before passing judgment. My success was built on that, on never leaving loose ends. I met Elena 12 years ago. Back then, she seemed like the missing piece to my puzzle. She was intelligent, elegant, and most of all, she appeared to understand the weight of my responsibilities. We got married and built what everyone called a model marriage. I gave her everything. I'm not just talking about jewelry or trips. I'm talking about absolute security. She never had to worry about a bill, health insurance, or the future. I handled the fortress walls, and she made sure everything inside looked perfect. Or at least, that's what I believed. Over time, my trust in her became absolute. I gave her full access to my finances, granted her legal authority to manage certain assets, and delegated the administration of our family wealth to her. I wanted her to feel like an integral part of my success, not just a spectator. Our routine was stable, almost predictable. We had a spacious house, the kind where even the silence feels expensive. I would come home late. We'd usually have dinner in a comfortable quiet, and I would lose myself in profitability reports. Elena was always there with a soft smile, asking if work wasn't consuming me too much. Now I realize that supposed concern was the beginning of her strategy. She started making subtle remarks about my memory, about alleged oversights I didn't remember committing. She'd say I forgot to pay certain services, or that I had authorized large withdrawals I had no recollection of approving. At the time, my net worth was well into 7 figures. It wasn't money to spend recklessly. It was working capital, the engine of my company. I saw my life as an immovable structure. I felt untouchable. I had the respect of my employees, the admiration of my peers, and what I believed was the unconditional love of a woman who had been by my side during the climb. I was never a man of vices or impulses. My only mistake was applying business logic to love. I assumed that if I fulfilled my part of the contract, provide, protect, remain faithful, the other side would do the same by default. As the company expanded, I spent more time away, closing deals and supervising new warehouses. Elena remained in charge of managing our private office. She had the passwords, the security tokens, and authorized signature rights. In my mind, it was like having an extension of myself at home. But while I was in strategic meetings, she was discovering just how easy it was to move pieces on a board I no longer watched with the same intensity. The balance was perfect. I generated the wealth, and she silently began draining it. What hurts the most when I look back isn't the money, it's the false sense of peace. I felt proud of the life I was giving her. I felt successful because my wife didn't have to lift a finger for anything beyond her own comfort. Emotionally, I was calm, almost arrogantly certain I controlled my destiny. I was at the peak of my career, physically in the best shape of my life, and the future looked like a straight line toward a golden retirement. Anyone who saw me back then would have said, "This man has everything." And I believed it too. I had no idea that beneath the foundation of my house, a tunnel was being dug. I didn't notice the sideways glances from trusted employees she quietly dismissed and replaced with people who owed loyalty to her instead of me. I didn't realize bank calls that once came directly to my office were now mysteriously rerouted to her personal phone. She was creating a parallel reality, one where I was the distant provider growing increasingly unstable, while she positioned herself as the savior of a fortune that was already starting to bleed. I was the architect of my own downfall, simply because I believed love was a safe harbor where pirates didn't exist. I was about to learn that the deepest betrayal doesn't come from an enemy. It comes from the person who sleeps beside you and knows exactly where your heart is, so she knows precisely where to drive the knife. It all started with a small detail, an irregularity in a transfer that didn't match our usual cash flow. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I remember the silence in my office as I reviewed the monthly statements. $50,000 were missing. That wasn't a number that could disappear because of a clerical error. When I got home, I asked Elena calmly, assuming it was an investment she had forgotten to mention. She didn't even blink. She looked at me with a mix of pity and reproach, set her wine glass down on the table, and sighed. She said we had already talked about it 2 weeks earlier, that the money had been moved to a savings account for tax payments, and that my memory was seriously starting to fail. She said it in such a soft, convincing tone that for a second, I doubted myself. That became the pattern for the next 6 months. Every time I found a hole, she had an explanation ready, followed immediately by an attack on my mental health. "Adrian, you're obsessing," she would say, while touching my face with a coldness I mistook for affection. "Work is burning out your brain. You don't even remember what you say anymore." She began leaving fake notes around the house, reminders of appointments that never existed, trying to make me believe I was losing my grip on reality. Meanwhile, the drip of money turned into a hemorrhage. Suspicion stopped being doubt the day I hired a private investigator without telling anyone. I didn't want to believe it, but my instinct, the same one that made me wealthy, was screaming that I was under attack. 3 days later, I received an envelope. The photos didn't lie. Elena wasn't at the spa or in yoga classes. She was at a luxury downtown apartment, a place I had never seen, registered under a shell company she had created. In the pictures, she was with a much younger man, a gym trainer with model-like looks who was wearing my clothes, driving one of my sports cars, and, the most painful part, smiling with a smugness that made my stomach twist. I stayed in my dark office for hours staring at those photos. I didn't scream. I didn't break anything. I felt an icy rage, the kind that seeps into your bones and freezes your heart. She wasn't just cheating on me. She was using the sweat of my labor to maintain a parasite. That same night, I confronted her. I didn't yell. I simply placed the photos on the dining table. She looked at them, and for a split second, I saw fear in her eyes. But it lasted only a moment. Her face quickly transformed into a mask of contempt. She laughed, a dry, cruel laugh. "And what are you going to do, Adrian?" she asked as she stood up. "Look at you. You're old, alone, and everyone already thinks you're losing your mind. I've spent the last 2 years making sure that legally you own nothing." Then she pulled out a document, a temporary restraining order based on falsified medical reports and manipulated testimonies. She told me that if I didn't leave the house immediately, she would call the police and claim my psychotic episode had turned violent. That was when I realized she had transferred nearly 80% of my liquid assets to offshore accounts, some under her lover's name. She had drained me. The house I paid for penny by penny was under a corporation she fully controlled. I stood there, watching the woman I loved turn into a monster right in front of me. She stepped closer, placed her hand on my chest, and whispered in my ear, "He's everything you're not anymore. Thanks for the money, paranoid. Now leave before they take you out in handcuffs." I walked out of that house with a small suitcase and a shattered heart, but with the clearest mind I'd ever had. I caught my reflection in the glass door, a 47-year-old man expelled from his own life, humiliated, financially declared dead. I got into my car, the only one not yet transferred into their names, and drove to a rundown motel. As traffic noise filled the room, I made myself a promise. She thought she had taken everything because she took the money. She didn't understand that what made me dangerous wasn't my bank account. It was my ability to build from ashes. She wanted a madman. I was about to give her a nightmare so real she wouldn't have anywhere to hide. The war had begun, and I had no intention of taking prisoners. I moved into a small, forgotten office that was still legally under my name, a space she had overlooked in her frenzy of looting. It was grey, filled with old files and the smell of stale coffee, but to me it became the command center of a silent war. I didn't look for comfort in friends or family. Elena had already poisoned their minds, convincing them I was unstable and dangerous. I was alone, and that was my greatest advantage. When no one expects anything from you, you have absolute freedom to move in the shadows. My first call was to an old ally, an attorney who operated in the cracks of the system, a man who didn't ask questions as long as the payment was fair. His name was Victor Hayes. We met in a dimly lit cafe. No hugs, no sympathy. I placed on the table what little I had left, a record of bank transactions I managed to recover from a cloud server she didn't know existed. Victor reviewed the documents with exasperating calm while I watched in silence. "They stripped you clean with precision, Adrian," he finally said. "But they made the mistake every greedy person makes. They left a trail of arrogance." Elena and her lover, the man who walked around my house wearing my clothes, had started spending the money at a reckless pace. Luxury purchases, direct transfers into his personal accounts, and most importantly, the creation of shell companies with no real business activity. They were laundering my money right under the system's nose. My plan wasn't to recover everything immediately. My plan was to make sure the system realized that money was contaminated. For months I became a ghost. I slept 4 hours a night, ate the bare minimum, and spent the rest of my time analyzing every legal document Elena had forced me to sign under deception. I discovered that in her rush to secure the house and accounts, she had forged my signature on 2 critical notarized documents while I was on a business trip. That was her first major mistake. Arrogance makes you believe everyone else is stupid, and she was convinced I was too crazy to check timestamps and seals. I began gathering proof of fraud, but I didn't go to the police. Not yet. I wanted her to feel safe. I wanted her to believe I was already history. Meanwhile, Victor began pulling strings, contacting vendors from my former company. Many of them owed me favors built over years. I asked for just one thing: delay payments and deliveries to the current administration, Elena's administration. I wanted to choke the cash flow. Without the operational engine I once ran, the company began to wobble. Elena knew nothing about logistics. She only knew how to spend. Within 3 months, client complaints piled up, and unpaid tax liabilities, the very ones she claimed were covered, started snowballing. I watched everything from my small office. I still had access to the company's security cameras, accounts she hadn't disabled, assuming I wouldn't remember the passwords. I saw her walk into what used to be my office, now redecorated with tasteless extravagance, arguing on the phone, yelling at employees who once respected me. She looked stressed, desperate. Her lover, of course, wasn't there to help. He only showed up to collect a check or drive the sports car. I smiled at the monitor. I was weaving a web so fine they couldn't even feel the threads tightening around their necks. The final piece of my preparation came from a strategic legal detail. I discovered that the shell corporation where she had diverted most of the capital contained a structural loophole. Any international transfer exceeding $1 million required authorization from a designated silent trustee. And due to an oversight by her own attorney, that role, in the original formation documents of the parent entity, was still legally tied to my consulting signature from years ago. She had the money, but technically, I still held the key that kept it locked inside the country. I sat back in my worn-out chair, looked at the calendar, and drew a red circle around a date. That night, Elena was hosting a gala event to celebrate a so-called company anniversary, a staged performance meant to reassure investors that everything was thriving. It would be the perfect stage. My patience had been infinite. My reconstruction had been silent. My mind was colder than the marble tomb she had dug for me. I was ready to stop being the paranoid man and become the executioner. The night of the gala finally arrived. I put on my best suit, the one she hadn't managed to burn, and made sure every detail was flawless. I didn't show up yelling or causing a scene. I walked into the main ballroom with the calm of a man picking up a package. Soft music floated through the air, mixed with the scent of expensive perfume. And there she was, standing in the center of the room, wearing a dress that cost more than the annual salary of some of my best employees, holding a champagne glass and clinging to that man's arm. He smiled with the arrogance of someone who thinks he owns a castle he didn't build. When they saw me, silence spread through the room like spilled oil. Elena turned pale. Her eyes widened, a mixture of hatred and fear. She rushed toward me, trying to maintain composure in front of the guests. "What are you doing here, Adrian? I told you if you came near me I'd call the police. You're out of control. Your paranoia is going to destroy you," she whispered through clenched teeth, while subtly signaling the security guards she had hired. I didn't move. I simply pulled a white envelope from my jacket and placed it in her hands. "I'm not here to fight, Elena. I'm here to deliver notice of a federal audit and the asset freeze order that was executed 10 minutes ago," I said in a low, icy voice that made her hands tremble. The security guard hesitated when he saw my composure. Behind me appeared 3 men in dark suits, agents from the Financial Crimes Division, and my attorney, Victor Hayes. Elena's face collapsed. She began stammering that I was lying, that this was another invention of my sick mind. But reality walked through the door at that exact moment. Her lover, spotting the agents, tried to slip out through a side exit. He didn't make it far. He was intercepted before reaching the threshold. At that very second, phones began ringing throughout the ballroom. Investors were receiving alerts. News that the company was under federal investigation for fraud and money laundering spread like wildfire. "Remember when you called me paranoid for questioning the transfers?" I said quietly, stepping close enough that only she could hear me. "You were right about one thing. I was obsessed. But not with the money, with the details. Like the fact that you forged my signature in 3 different states, or that you used a bridge account I created 10 years ago, one where I'm still the sole legal administrator." She tried to scream. She even tried to slap me. But her hands were shaking so badly that her champagne glass slipped from her fingers and shattered across the floor, staining her silk dress. Within half an hour, the ballroom emptied. The friends she cultivated with my money vanished like shadows at sunrise. She stood alone in the middle of the dance floor, surrounded by federal agents calmly explaining her rights. I glanced at her lover, now in handcuffs. The man was whining, blaming everything on her, claiming he knew nothing, that he was just an employee. Elena looked at him with pure disgust, realizing the man she risked everything for was nothing more than a coward without a spine. I stood there watching the scene with bitter satisfaction. I didn't feel joy. I felt relief. Months of humiliation lifted from my shoulders as I watched her perfect mask crumble.
"The house isn't yours anymore, Elena," I said as I turned to leave.
"The corporation that owned it entered liquidation because of the liabilities you created. You have 24 hours to collect your belongings before the locks are changed. Oh, and one more thing. That offshore account where you stored the loot? I was never paranoid. I was the one who set the bait. That money never left the country. It's under judicial custody as evidence of your fraud." I walked toward the exit without looking back. I could hear her screaming, calling me a monster. I could hear her desperate sobs as she realized she had nothing left. No money, no lover, no reputation, and a criminal trial ahead that would likely send her to prison for years. As I stepped into the cool night air, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Balance. Justice isn't always fast. It isn't always sweet. But when it arrives with the cold precision of truth, it is unstoppable.
It's been a year since that night in the ballroom.
Sometimes I pause and think about the man I was when all of this began. The man who believed success was measured by bank balances and that loyalty was guaranteed by a wedding ring. That man died the moment I heard the word paranoid come out of the mouth of the person I trusted most. The man I am today is quieter, more restrained, and undeniably more dangerous. Not because I have more power, but because I now understand exactly what human beings are capable of when greed clouds their judgment.
Elena ended up in a cell, awaiting a sentence that won't be short.
Her lover, the man who wore my clothes and slept in my bed, was the first to testify against her in exchange for a reduced charge. I was told she couldn't endure the betrayal of the very man she betrayed me for. It's a poetic irony that brings me no pleasure, only confirmation of what I already knew. Traitors have no homeland. When the ship starts sinking, they devour each other. I've recovered part of my assets, but they don't matter to me the same way anymore. I live in a smaller place now, one where the silence doesn't feel expensive, just necessary. I'm not looking for new relationships, and I don't feel the need to convince anyone of my sanity.
My family tried to reconnect, apologizing for believing Elena's lies.
I received them with the same cold courtesy I would offer a stranger. Trust is like glass. Once it's crushed, it never regains its clarity, no matter how carefully you try to piece it back together. I've learned that intelligence means nothing without relentless vigilance. I spent years building an external wall to protect my family from the threats of the world, never realizing the enemy was already inside, sleeping under the same sheets, studying my weaknesses. When I look back now, I don't feel hatred. Hatred consumes energy, and I prefer to use mine to preserve my freedom. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's watching life collect its debts. I didn't have to dirty my hands with violence. I simply stopped protecting her from her own mistakes. I let her walk to the edge of the abyss she dug herself, and I stopped holding her hand when she decided to jump.
The cold precision of facts is the harshest judge there is.
If this story felt as intense to you as it was for me to live it, leave a like and tell me in the comments what you would have done. And if you're not subscribed yet, turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories.